people who have spent time in a psych ward, what is the craziest thing you've witnessed? Story 1. I was in an adolescent inpatient facility for 30 days. Two people come to mind. One kid named David, who was very tall for his age. I think he was only 13. He insisted on watching Friday the 13th movies on movie nights, and everyone was afraid to disagree with him because of his violent nature and frequent homicidal fantasies. He hated taking his meds, and probably 2 or 3 times a week he'd brawl with the psych nurses over it. No joke, it took 5 to 6 large grown men to overcome this kid. He was scary. The other one was just sad, a girl named Wendy. She was 13, really nice, but she always wore the same clothes, and she stank really, really bad. Apparently this is a common defense for kids who have been repeatedly raped, assaulted by family. They don't clean themselves, or they'll even soil themselves to make themselves undesirable to their abuser. I gave her a big hug every night in the common area when it was time to go to our cells. Story 2. My mother worked in an asylum in Ireland when she was about 15. This was in the early 60s. She loved working there, despite the fact that some of the patients would physically try and kill her. One patient always stuck out to her. Every day he would tell my mom he was going to kill her when she finished work. She knew he loved music, so would tell him she was out dancing that night and could he wait until the next day, which he agreed to. The next day he would forget what he had said and would threaten her again, and she'd say the same thing again. This went on for a couple of years that she worked there. Story 3. My brother-in-law had a stint in a psych ward a little over a year ago, and on a particularly manic day they were in the middle of the community room and started singing, "I have a structured settlement and I need cash now." This was then met by about 40 to 50 psych patients shouting back, "Call JG. Wentworth, 877, cash now." After getting a few verses and the orderlies stepped in and kindly requested they stop, which was kinda a shame since it sounded like they were all having a good time. Story 4. I've worked in one for about 2 years now. The staff are just as crazy. Patient got into the ceiling, couldn't get them down for a while. Patient milked themselves into their coffee. Did you know some antipsychotics make you lactate? The entire adolescent unit escaping because maintenance forgot to lock the gate. Don't worry, they all came back eventually. And myself getting a concussion from a patient trying to escape. They weren't successful, but at least I didn't work for 6 weeks. Story 5. I was a social worker at an institution that had a hall for what we called lifers. It was essentially for people who had no hopes of ever being released due to their conditions. Anyway, my hall had 14 beds and it was full. There was this one guy who was huge. He was 6'7" and about 350. His name was Simon. He suffered from drug-induced schizophrenia and had bipolar disorder. He talked to himself all day but never talked to others. All the other men in the ward were scared of him. Story 6. A girl grabbed my toe while I was sleeping. I woke up and said, "What the F?" and she ran off. I went to the front desk to complain. And while I'm talking to the lady, the girl jumped on my back and clung like a monkey while screaming. It was bizarre. I threw her off me and the lady just said sorry about that. Story 7. Was with a bunch of teens on a pediatric ward, but we all had special rooms by the nurse's desk with shatterproof wired glass so the nurses could always look in on us easily, and the bathrooms had no locks. Myself and another girl were in for anorexia. Another guy was suicidal to the point where he couldn't have any cutlery but a plastic spoon for meals, no blankets, special pajamas, etc. And then there was a young homeless guy who'd been hit by a car while squeegeeing for change, so his leg was in a full cast, yet he still had a habit of sneaking around in his wheelchair and hoarding extra supplies from the kitchen, the kids' playroom, the nurse's station, etc., so they kept him in one of the psych rooms. We formed a weird little club and would often play cards in a lounge area together. Conversations would go something like this. Me: "Hey, does anyone want this cheese?" I snuck it into my pocket so nurse thought I ate it. Homeless kid: "Mine." Dabes: "Here, you can have these beads I swiped from craft time." Other anorexic: "I'll get you some ice cream and saltines if you find me some sewing gear." I'm gonna sew some batteries into my hair scrunchie for my next weigh-in day. Suicidal kid, do you think I dive could scoop my eyeball out with a spoon? And so on. It was a very bizarro time in my life. Story 8. The funniest thing I ever saw spent total of about 3 years in my teens and early 20s. A kid in seclusion who was having a genuinely good time making staff's life a living nightmare while he was in there. Took apart the plastic mattress, tore the foam inside into small pieces, donned the empty mattress, and started yelling, "I'm Gumby, damn it," while tossing the pieces of foam around like confetti. Even most of the staff were laughing about it. Story 9. When I was 19 and admitted the first time, I was anxious already and could barely sleep the first night. My roommate was quiet, which didn't alarm me at first. The next day I went to the common room and talked to some people, and then later went back to my room and found that my roommate had scribbled "find them" all over the walls and was talking to herself. I was terrified and grabbed a nurse who tried to talk to her but couldn't make any sense out of what she said, and I asked to stay in another room. I stayed in the restraint room that night by myself and woke up the next morning to a fight in the hallway and nurses running past my room. Apparently one guy pulled out his D in front of the wrong patient and got punched. Then later that week, I was cornered by the same guy who pulled out his D and asked if I wanted to have S in the bathroom. I literally cried after that and was terrified, so I would say my whole first trip there. Story 10. Not a psych ward but an inmate at a jail. I spent some time as a trustee at who was very mentally ill. Dude had apparently been arrested after being drunk for the better part of the last month straight and was withdrawing hard as well as obviously not being older mentally. He was in his own isolation cell, and everyone had heard him screaming all sorts of perverse, insane, and nonsensical shit since he was put in there. A while after dark, we got called over to do a cleanup of his cell, and what I saw in there was like something out of a horror movie. Blood on every surface, as well as just about every other bodily fluid one can imagine, as well as shit. Even on the ceiling, and that must have been a feat to accomplish. Parts of his scalp had been pulled off and stuck to the mirror over the sink, which contained a mixture of the aforementioned bodily fluids and was no longer draining as a result. To top it off, he had pulled out many of his own teeth, which were scattered just about everywhere. I didn't vomit, but I certainly would have if I had stayed around. I just noped out and told them to get someone else to handle that. Easily one of the most disturbing things I've ever witnessed in person, and really showed me a different side of mental illness I'm not sure I'm glad to know exists. Story 11. Not a patient but an employee. Had a 16-year-old kid common who was about 6'220 pounds. Built like a linebacker. I found out since he was technically a child he somehow ended up at an autism school for children with very little security. He ended up inflicting a TBI on one of the teachers and got sent to us. The kid had a violent streak the likes I hadn't seen before. He knew he was stronger than most and liked to fight unprovoked, and it always took 4 to 6 people to restrain him. I never seen a patient spend more time than him in the safety room, an incredibly small padded room with nothing in it. His parents wouldn't authorize his move somewhere else, and they wouldn't take him home either. We were not equipped for someone with his level of violence. So there he sat, for 1.5 years. It wasn't like a single incident that was crazy, it was the entire situation. Story 12. Another story is not as crazy as it is heartbreaking. But in my time working I've seen my fair share of suicidal ideations patients, but only once have I seen someone who had completely in every possible sense of the phrase given up, unlike anyone else I've come across. He was 60 plus and had spent his whole life homeless and in and out of institutions, living with his brother and his brother's family periodically until the patient became too much to burden for the family. I spent every shift with him on a 1-to-1 order to have eyes on the patient 24/7, as every chance he could get he would self-harm with whatever he could find. I'm only a technician, so I don't have a degree of any sort other than a high school diploma. I still would listen to him talk for the hours I spent with him, the most nihilistic and pessimistic tangents I've ever heard, a sense of hopelessness and despair I've never considered possible. Even the mountain of medications he was given seemed to have little affect. And then as his hold ended he was discharged. I'm not a doctor or certified in any way as I stated before, but I can't believe he was given the okay to be released. This event sticks with me because I was left without any answers or explanation of what happened. The next day his room was occupied by a new patient. Story 13. Most amazing. For some reason a piano was in the psych ward. A patient who never spoke started playing. She knew every piece by heart. The entire ward of psychotics, manics, and even staff went and sat in that room. Not a word was spoken for a good half hour. Craziest. Family members choking a patient because his sister gave another patient a blowjob. A guy who thought he was Jesus convincing the entire ward to meet on the balcony to discuss ways of breaking out. A guy would run away every day, steal a car, and drive back to the ward. People speaking in tongues. Scary. Story 14. I work in EMS and volunteered in a PISH ward briefly. So my experience is always a bit superficial, but the craziest part for me is how a lot of patients oftentimes act completely normal and rational. I've transported a lot of people to a psych ward that were diagnosed with all sorts of illnesses. But from my interaction with them, they were completely normal and just had some general anxiety. A lot of people I've observed and wondered why the hell are they even here. Story 15. I was in one with people who were mostly in for suicidal ideation. One patient was a nice young girl who did not eat anything the entire week I was there. A few months later I was at the grocery store and she was working there but was getting fired by what looked like a horrible bully of a manager. Watching her walk to her car absolutely defeated broke my heart. I hope she is doing better now. Story 16. Guy had a tattoo carved into his neck. Apparently he took a pen in his fist and repeatedly carved it into his skin right on his neck. It looked very scratchy and was still red despite it apparently being pretty old. You know how really young kids grip a crayon in their fist and grind it against the paper really hard? If you made a fist with your left hand and put it below the left ear, that was exactly how he must have done it. Story 17. It felt like I was in a movie almost. There was a girl my age and a man about 10 years older than me. Richard and Jess. Jess greeted me with a conversation like, yeah, they said I'd be here only a few days too. It's been 3 months now. Be nice to the nurses and maybe they'll let you out early. Alright, sounds like the start to a horror game. Richard was more friendly and loved going on about quantum physics, saying it'll change our future. We were at a table and out of boredom I folded some origami. Richard picked it up and started telling me about how I should market my origami figures. Besides that, room temp coffee, no butter knives, and staff outside the shower door. Oh, and the unnecessary amount of sedatives for a suicidal teenage girl. Story 18. Not much in particular. I just kinda had a bit of imposter syndrome because I saw people zonked out of their minds from schizophrenia or bipolar meds or whatnot, and there I was just kinda like I'm sad and wanna die sometimes. The craziest thing was how hard they tried to shove religion down our throats, seemed almost criminal tbh. Story 19. Not a patient but an employee. Seen countless patients attacked by other patients. Many serious injuries and a couple that came close to death. Some of the patients' backstories can be wild. Some are almost unbelievably tragic, some are legit criminal. Some of the most foul and disgusting personal hygiene I've ever witnessed. Worst was a patient who had no concept of using a restroom. They would simply shit or piss themselves wherever they were sitting or standing. Was real fun when they decided to do it during meal time. I think the most shocking thing, though, is how you can have some truly awful and psychotic patients who turn out to be genuinely cool people once you get them on consistent meds. I'm talking 100% turnarounds. Of course, then they get discharged to stop taking their meds and the cycle repeats.